Good morning, fellow whiskey lovers. Yes, I am in New York City, Brooklyn to be specific.
I'm Colin, and this is Kings County Distillery, which is New York City's oldest distillery. So maybe I'll just talk about how I got started as a distiller. And Al Capone was actually born across the street and grew up in this sort of rough Irish neighborhood. But there is so much rich history here, not just in Brooklyn, not just in New York City generally, but even in this particular location here in the Navy Yard. Cool, so this is the Paymaster Building. It was built in 1899, and it is now Kings County Distillery. So we're gonna head inside and actually walk through the distillation floor and see the process of how we make our moonshine, bourbon, and other whiskeys here at Kings County. So this is the main distillery floor. This is where all the whiskey actually gets made, pretty much grain to barrel in this room. I'm gonna start over here and talk a little bit about the grain that we use. So we just make whiskey, which means essentially the only ingredient that we're using is some grain of some sort. And our main product is bourbon, and bourbon has to be 51% corn by law. In our case, our bourbon is 70% corn. So over here, this is how the corn comes to us from the farm. In this case, it's an organic corn from Lakeview Organic Grain, which is a farm in upstate New York. It's milled with a roller mill as opposed to a hammer mill, which is something that was a little unusual for bourbon distillers. They do it at Maker's Mark, they did it at Stitzel-Weller. So it's a little bit of a different milling process, which means you end up cooking the corn a little longer, but I would argue you get a little bit better flavor from it. So we'll go through this entire ton of corn in 2 days. So we're consuming a lot of grain as a part of our process. So that's the main ingredient. Then the other ingredient is here. This is malted barley. So malt obviously is any grain that's been germinated. Malted barley worldwide is the most common. So the word malt is almost synonymous with malted barley. But by sprouting the grain, there are enzymes that will convert the starch, in our case in the corn, to sugar. So most bourbons have between 5 and 10% of their mash bill as malted barley. We have sort of what you would call a high malt recipe bourbon. We don't have any wheat or rye in the recipe, which would be traditional for a Kentucky bourbon. So we have just corn and malted barley, which I suppose you could argue makes us a little bit more like a European whiskey, which traditionally are often made only with malted barley. So a little bit of a different recipe. So that's for the main bourbon. And then we also have a peated bourbon, which is made it's made with this kind of malted barley, but it's been exposed to peat. So it has a little bit of a smoky, that kind of almost rubberish characteristic that people associate with Lafroig or Ardbeg, some of the smokier scotches. We have also made a rye whiskey in the past and a single malt. All of those are really made with just these 2 different grains, and within the malt, 2 different kind of preparations of the grain. The first step is in our cooker. So this is 250 gallons of water, 300 pounds of corn, 55 pounds of malt. First we'll bring it up to 212 to a boil, add the corn, let it steep for about an hour, bring it down to 158 degrees, add the malt. Then as the malt goes in, it will start to liquefy the corn and and it'll taste as though we've dumped sugar in the tank, when in fact we've just added this grain, which has enzymes that are a catalyst to break down the starch and convert it to sugar. So that mash is then cooled to room temperature and gets pumped through this, which is just a separator. So again, most bourbons in Kentucky are fermented on the grain. Most Scotch whiskeys are fermented off the grain. So we're doing sort of a hybrid where we are fermenting bourbon off the grain. So we use this machine to separate all the spent grain that goes to a farm or it gets composted and gets just sort of emptied into these bins. The liquid itself goes into this tank, which just then pumps it into our fermenters. This fermenter is pretty active. This is about 2 days in. So this is corn, malt, and then we'll sprinkle yeast over the top of the fermenter. So that's, the fermentation will last for about 4 days. And this is yeast consuming dissolved oxygen and sugar, and they're producing carbon dioxide and alcohol. So people don't necessarily realize that whiskey in its first iteration is carbonated in the same way that beer is carbonated. It's just that carbonation will get removed later on through the distillation process. We use open fermenters, which are traditional. You see them sometimes in Kentucky, sometimes in Scotland. One advantage is you can actually do a large volume of fermentation without cooling it down. So by having an open fermenter, it keeps the temperature low for a large volume because the fermentation actually generates some amount of heat. It also exposes the fermentation to wild yeast or wild bacteria that are in the atmosphere of the distillery, which can also help expedite the fermentation, which is useful because, in fact, we want a very quick fermentation because our focus really isn't in so much on the fermentation side of things as the distillation side of things. So you could drink this. It tastes a little bit like a summer beer, like a sour wheat beer almost, even though there's no wheat in the recipe. But this 6% alcohol at the end of the process is what goes into the still. This fermenter is a little bit more like what you would see at the end of the process. So the bubbling has slowed down considerably. It's a lot thinner. It has a little bit of a sour kind of interesting flavor. And that's what is going to go into the still. And then, people are sort of a little shocked by the open fermentation, but in fact, you have to remember that we're not really drinking this liquid. We're really drinking a chemical that we're extracting from this liquid. So that is sort of the next step, which is that this is going to get pumped into the stills themselves. So these are our stills. These are true pot stills. That word pot still gets thrown around a lot, especially at craft distilleries, where they have a pot, but they also have a column next to the pot. And that's not really a true pot still. It's more like a hybrid still or a batch still. In our case, a true alembic or pot still really just cooks the beer on one side of the still, turns it to steam. And so in this case, this black pipe is compressed steam. That's the heat source. That goes into a coil, a stainless steel coil inside the still that's boiling the steam to vapor, travels over the lin arm into this condenser, and then you can see the whiskeys coming right out of the still. So we are double distilling in every instance. Some distillers will triple distill. We actually get, this goes back to when I was home distilling. I always felt like triple distilling kind of stripped out too much flavor and made the whiskey, brought it too much closer to vodka. So one advantage of these beautiful pot stills is they give you a really rich textural flavor. I think it's one thing that people don't talk about when they talk about craft spirits, craft distilling, is that actually by putting so much emphasis on the distillation, we can actually make a much smoother whiskey as it's coming out of the still. So after one distillation, we will reduce 1,000 liters of wash or distiller's beer down to about 40, from 6% alcohol down to about 600 liters at 40% alcohol. And then that's our low wines. And we take all of that liquid. You would say, oh, 40%, that sounds like what we drink, but it's still kind of funky, kind of oily, a little bit like a skunky beer sort of flavor. And so we'll take the low wines and put it into the smaller of the two stills. That's the spirit still. And then what's coming out of the spirit still is actually the finished whiskey. So the very first part of what comes out of the spirit still is the foreshots. That we sort of use a mangling of the words that are used in Scotch distilling, but foreshots to us are what we throw away. Then there's a period of heads, which is too sort of solventy, nail polish removery. Just doesn't have the right flavor profile, but is still drinkable. So the heads we put into the faints receiver, then we collect hearts in the spirit receiver, and then we'll move this back at the end of this spirit run, at the end of the hearts, to collect all the faints that are coming out of the still, the tails, what we would call it. So it seems like we're sort of squarely in the middle of the run right now. So we see a little bit of a seasonal variation because we have no artificial cooling of our fermenters. So in the summer, we get a little bit of a different flavor profile than in the winter. And this time of year, it's really just kind of awesome. That's good stuff. I mean, it's always good stuff, I suppose. But, you're always sort of checking in on things, and because we're around it every day, there's obviously things that you notice when they're a little bit off. So the reason the stills are made of copper is that it's removing copper sulfate, which can sometimes contribute to a negative flavor profile. Pretty much any still in any distillery around the world is going to be made out of copper. And because these stills have so much copper in them, they're kind of shedding a lot of this, kind of what looks like a little bit of a patina on the inside of the still, like the Statue of Liberty, little flecks of green and black, which can sometimes fall into the liquid. So this is just a little cheesecloth to catch any chunks of copper that are falling out of the still. If a Scotch distillery would have a spirit safe isn't required by American law, and it costs like $20,000. So we were sort of like, that's not intrinsic to what we need. We'll just go ahead and skip that. But it means we sort of have had to innovate little tweaks to replicate some of the things that would be happening in a spirit safe. The heart of our run generally falls between 65 and 75% alcohol. So on average, what comes out of the spirit run is a very high proof spirit at 70% alcohol. You can actually see it, but in most instances we're making bourbon, and we will dilute this down to our barrel proof. So we have a little bit of a lower barrel entry proof than is maybe otherwise common for a Kentucky distillery. In our case, it's 58% alcohol. 62.5 is the maximum barrel proof. That's part of what's written into the American, liquor, alcohol, whiskey production law. So we drop ours a little bit lower to 58. So over here, these are barrels waiting to get filled up with spirit. So we use, if we're making bourbon, it's a charred new oak barrel that's written into law, but we can use all different sizes. So we have a 5-gallon barrel, which makes sort of a 2-summer bourbon, so around 18 months to 24 months. A 10-gallon barrel, which is a 2 to 3 year barrel. A 15-gallon barrel, which is a 4-year barrel. And then 53-gallon barrels, which we think will age for 7 to 12 years. We don't have any of those 53-gallon barrels that we have released yet. So in a lot of ways, we're filling a lot more whiskey barrels than we're actually pulling from inventory to fill up bottles. Kind of building up this inventory of aged whiskey for the future. So the next stop is actually the barrel room. So we'll go up there next, although we'll maybe stop at the bottling line and just see that, because that's the sort of last step of the process before the bottle goes to the store.
All right, finished up with part 2. I hope you had a great time seeing inside the distillery. I love the passion. Straight out of Kentucky, this guy really knows his stuff because he did it in his kitchen, on his stovetop, with a still that he bought on the internet. Peated Bourbon, I think you may have heard mention of that in there. Well, part number 3, we're gonna taste that Peated Bourbon along with some of the other great whiskeys that they make at the Kings County Distillery. So, from Brooklyn, New York, on to part 3 of Kings